Jadeva Kharja, and welcome to the latest episode of the Rebel Matters podcast. Our guests this week are Niamh Ní Bhrian, Fionn Wallace and Rory Rowan, and the discussion that you're about to hear was recorded in December 2025 after our guests had presented the Neutrality Roadshow in the Cultúalnn here in West Belfast. During this episode, we discussed the current threats to Irish neutrality, the prospect of a united Ireland and what that might look like in terms of Irish neutrality, and the threats to Irish sovereignty through a potential remilitarisation of the country, both north and south. With the world being dragged into yet another war being led by the United States and Israel just in the last few days, there has never been a more important time to get informed about Irish neutrality and what we need to do to protect it. This episode is a huge step up for us in terms of production here at Rebel Matters, as it's our first multicam episode. So it took way longer to put together than usual, but we're focusing on creating more video podcasts this year and have loads of great guests lined up for the coming episodes. We've also brought on a couple of new team members to help to produce the show. I want to say a massive thank you to the patrons of the podcast who have supported us, and in particular for their support in recent months. We're looking forward to repaying the loyalty of our patrons by producing some valuable episodes that will make a contribution to the conversation around anti-imperialism and culture in the coming months. As I say, our focus is going to be on creating video podcasts, and they'll be primarily hosted on YouTube. But we're going to continue to publish on our regular audio platforms as well. If you want to help us to build Rebel Matters, then like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can also visit patreon.com/Rebel Matters to check out the various tiers of support that are available there for our patrons. Finally, I want to say a huge thank you to our guests on this episode, as well as the Rebel Matters team that helped to produce this episode. And that's it from me for now. So enjoy episode number 128 of the Rebel Matters podcast. Thanks very much, lads, for joining us in the Rebel Matters podcast studio after a great event in the Cultúalnn, discussing the issue of Irish neutrality and a lot of the things that kind of come along with that and the threat that it's under at the minute. And maybe a good starting point for our conversation tonight is maybe just to explain a little bit about what the triple lock is, because it's a term that I am familiar with. I am aware that it's under threat from various aspects, but at the same time, it's still something that I maybe haven't got a full grasp on, and maybe a lot of other people would be kind of in a similar boat. So I'll hand over to Niamh here to maybe get us started.
So the triple lock, very simply, the triple lock is a piece of legislation. It governs the deployment of Irish troops overseas. So it sets out that for more than 12 troops to be sent overseas on a mission, there must be approval on 3 levels. So there has to be approval from the Cabinet. There has to be approval from Dáil Éireann, so a Dáil resolution. And then the third area of approval, the third area basically, which is the one that the government wants to get rid of, is that the mission that those troops are being sent on has to have a United Nations mandate. That is basically the triple lock. It's a piece of legislation. It governs the deployment of troops when they're sent overseas. The requirement for a United Nations mandate actually dates back to 1960. So the Defence Amendment Act 1960 is when Ireland starts engaging with the world. So Ireland joins the United Nations in 1955. We start deploying peacekeepers overseas in 1958. And then in 1960, we set out in the Defence Amendment Act that we will only send our troops overseas if we're sending them on United Nations mandated missions. And this is us, Ireland, saying to the world, we have no intention of sending our troops in an invasive, illegal, mission. We will only send them on missions that are approved under international law, so with the United Nations mandate. That 1960 commitment to the United Nations was then reaffirmed in the context of the Nice Treaty And that's when we start to use the term triple lock. So triple lock was a term that we started to use in the early 2000s, but it actually relates to a piece of legislation from 1960. And then that is repackaged for the Nice Treaty and then again for the Lisbon Treaty, and it's seen as a guarantee to people that we will not send Irish troops overseas to engage in foreign wars. We will only send them overseas to participate in United Nations mandated missions. The government now wants to basically remove all impediments to send Irish troops overseas, to be able to participate in war-fighting missions, in conflict, in EU battle groups, in NATO-led missions, but they cannot do that without the triple lock being dismantled. And so instead of being honest with the people and going to the people and saying, listen, we want to play our part in this European war project, we want to send Irish people on imperialist wars, but we need to get rid of the triple lock, obviously the people would be, there'd be uproar. So they can't go out and say to the people what they're actually planning to do. So they have concocted a whole load of nonsense about what the triple lock actually is. They've rolled out this narrative that it's about a Russian veto. There's no such Russian veto, that the triple lock and neutrality have got nothing to do with each other, which is also not true. So they've rolled out a whole load of nonsense. So the reason we got on the road and started doing these roadshows was to kind of, on the one hand, give people information about what's at stake if the triple lock goes. The triple lock, like I said, it's not the be-all and end-all, but without the triple lock, if it's gone, Ireland then becomes an active participant in wars. And we had that in the legislation that plans to dismantle the triple lock has already gone through the Irish legislative scrutiny process, and during that scrutiny process it's on the record that we will be able to participate in war fighting missions, in NATO missions, in EU battle groups once the triple lock is gone. So that's on the record. So if politicians vote to remove the triple lock, they are doing so with that record. That's on the record. And just maybe to say, like, I get up every morning and I check Telesur to see if Venezuela has been invaded. We've spent the last two years checking Al Jazeera every morning to see how many more people have been killed in Gaza. Like, we have normalisation of genocide, we've normalisation of war, total erosion of international law. So any right-thinking, reasonable, rational leadership would be like, we need more safeguards to keep Ireland out of war. But at this particular moment, the Irish government, instead of increasing safeguards, is actually enhancing them. Is actually removing them so that so that Ireland will end up smack bang in the next war at the way things are going. So, that's...
Yeah, but I would just add, like, the Defence Amendment Bill 2025, which is the piece of legislation which will, if it's voted with a Dáil majority, probably in the new year, in the first 3 months, I would imagine, of the new year, when the Dáil comes back from the break. If that goes through, the bill makes it explicitly clear that if this passes, you have a situation where, with just the cabinet agreeing among themselves, they'll be able to send up to 100 Irish Defence Forces to anywhere in the world, effectively. So, like, there's a loophole in the text that's clearly open for NATO. It says, like, the OSCE, the EU, and then any regional alignment, any other regional alignment of states, which is NATO. That's just another word for NATO. So, and then that's just without anything at all. Like, so at the moment we have a situation where we have a vote in the Dáil if you want to send more than 12 to any foreign mission. If this passes, there'll be no vote in the Dáil. It'll just be the government agreeing with itself that they want to send 100 Irish Defence Forces anywhere. If they have a Dáil majority vote, according to this legislation, if it passes, they'll be able to send a limitless number of Irish troops to any conflict in the world. So that's kind of what's at stake here.
And just quickly, with the three people in the microphones, one of the logic or the ways that this is being described and framed by the government ministers and by lots of media commentators is that Ireland should have the kind of maturity to recognise itself, take its sovereignty. So as Niamh was saying, there's this idea that looking for a UN mandate to send Irish troops to take part, a limited number of Irish troops to take part in peacekeeping, is subject to this veto from Russia and China, right? And sometimes they throw in, America as well, it could be vetoing us, right? So they say that basically we're under a veto from the United Nations Security Council. We want to get away from that. And that's a good thing, because that allows us to exercise our sovereignty, exercise our democracy, and be a kind of mature nation. What we see in the bill, and that point that Fionn's looking at, is this is explicitly about further integration into the military structures of the EU and NATO, and furthering Ireland's dependency on the EU and American power. So there's a disingenuous, which is very typical of the conversation around this, that this is about maturity and democracy. This is but in the face of an international veto. This is exactly the opposite. It's to choose against the United Nations, against international law, against peacekeeping, for war with the EU and NATO.
It's in a way kind of ironic that you say that, because Irish military neutrality has been inextricably linked with the concept of Irish sovereignty historically. And if we look at even over the course of the last 2 years with the genocide in Palestine, probably more people are becoming aware of how compromised Irish neutrality already is, if we consider the fact that there's been military flights coming through Shannon for many years now, not just over the course of the last 2 years. But how have we got to the stage now where there's a real tangible threat to the whole concept of Irish neutrality, or what's left of it, from a governmental level?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose often when we start to look at kind of Irish neutrality and look at a kind of a tangible example of that and how it's being eroded, you will look at Shannon Airport, because it just seems to be it's the very obvious example of how our neutrality is being eroded. And I mean, you can go back and look at various ways in which Irish neutrality has been eroded, but I think there's a steady shift since 2003, when, I mean, I'm from County Clare, and I remember it really clearly, like US military flights in the sky and US military in the airport, and it's just been normalised. And, you know, often when you fly out from Shannon, if you fly in and out of Shannon, you'll encounter US soldiers in the airport. There's a hotel in Clare called the Clare Inn, and they stay there overnight, so you can often go down to the Clare Inn, I don't know, for a coffee or whatever, and the whole hotel will just be flooded with US soldiers. So to get to the question of how we got to this point, I mean, it wasn't just sprung upon us. I think it's been, I mean, you can go back to, like, we often go back to, in the Roadshow, we often go back to talking about kind of Frank Aiken. I mean, we usually actually start with 1790 and Wolfe Tone, but I don't think we have enough time for 1790 to Wolfe Tone for the podcast. But there's the 1790 Wolfe Tone stuff, there's the 1914 Irish Neutrality League, James Connolly, Neither King Nor Kaiser stuff. Then you have the partitioning of Ireland, World War II neutrality. Then you have kind of, the Frank Aiken example of going to the UN and trying to use Irish neutrality there. And then you kind of have the economic, the entry there is US economic power, using Ireland as a springboard to get into the European Union, Ireland joining the European Union then becoming more militarised. Nice Treaty, Lisbon Treaty in particular, sets out the legal underpinning for what becomes and is today a military union. So you have the US economic power, Ireland becoming a hotbed basically for foreign direct investment, and what all of that means for Irish sovereignty. Neutrality and sovereignty are intertwined. You've all of what's going on in Europe, and then you have what's going on in Britain, which we set out a bit earlier, and we might talk about that. But you've all of these converging factors, and then you have the Ukraine war kicks off, and then then it's like all of these things that have been building up under the surface suddenly blow up. And then it's fine to say we need to rethink Irish neutrality. Like if you were to say we need to rethink Irish neutrality in 2019, 2018, it probably wouldn't have, people would have pushed back against it. But in 2022, we're told by Micheál Martin, everything has changed. And it's like now the time is ripe to actually go full force with this agenda of like fully eroding any shred of Irish neutrality. And it's kind of, we often come back to the question of profit, like, it's this idea that there's so much money to be made from war. War is so profitable for a lot of people. And now the time is ripe to cash in. And you have kind of, this idea, like there was an arms fair held in Dublin a few years back, and it was called Building the Ecosystem, hosted by the government. And it was this idea that we can be part of this too. We can make money from this. This is a great opportunity. So there's an awful lot of money to be made if you dismantle Irish neutrality. So it's, all of those kind of converging points bearing down on Ireland, pressure coming from outside. I mentioned the US, Britain, the EU, pressure coming from outside. Then you have an arms lobby group that is set up in Dublin. I think it was 2021, the Irish Defence and Security Association. You have an arms lobby group that's directly lobbying the government to get access to the Irish market. One of the members of the lobby group is Lockheed Martin, biggest arms company in the world. So there's an incredible amount of pressure bearing down in Ireland, and there's a political class that are compradors. They're willing to be bought off. They don't represent the people. So it's just us then, the people, who are trying to push back against that massive structure. But we can't do nothing either. So, yeah.
I mean, coming back to it's the people. I mean, in the Constitution, Irish sovereignty is vested in the people of Ireland, and it says that in the last word on matters of national policy, it's up to the people of Ireland, and that's why we do have referendums. We have a special carve out for the transposing of EU legislation, whatever, into Irish law, and that's why we have referendums. That's why we had the referendums on the Nice and Lisbon Treaty. When it was put to the people the last time, we said no in Nice, and then as Niamh explained, we got the carve out and the Seville Declaration, and we got these solemn declarations, and that was reasserted with Lisbon. But now they're trying to do this thing without going back to the people. So like it's anti-democratic in the extreme, and Micheál Martin is one of the central people driving this. And he's happy enough to talk about authoritarian regimes, here, there, and everywhere, that are a threat to Irish democracy, and so on. But he's basically doing something that any authoritarian, quote unquote, leader would be immensely proud of. It's just hammering something through in the most disingenuous way possible, and then the media is right on board, backing up everything with these narratives about Russians under the bed, effectively, and then China is, this kind of distant threat that's coming for us, and we need to be able to defend ourselves. And then the other argument is you need to defend neutrality. So how can we be neutral and defend ourselves? And this is a whole other discourse that it's been twisted, that people are now, it's just kind of natural to kind of think, well, what if we were invaded by Russia? Because it just makes sense to everybody now that Russia is such a boogeyman that they're coming for us. They're naturally coming for us. But this is it's the media are whipping this up as hard as they possibly can at the moment, and it is having an effect. I mean, the polling, there was two kind of big polls on the triple lock itself. Like there's different polls on Irish neutrality, and Karen Devine does great work on this, where she's looked into pretty much every poll going back to 1981 or 2, and she's found that over that period up to now, consistently 4 out of 5 Irish people want to maintain Irish neutrality, and they link it to our sense of independence, and it's kind of see it as part of the Irish, like part of being Irish is being neutral. 2023 we had a poll, pretty sure, where it was 42 or 3% of Irish people thought that the triple lock needed to be amended in some way, that it wasn't fit for purpose. And they would already put a lot of work into this narrative that it wasn't fit for purpose. Now, after a lot of work and a lot of column inches and a lot of radio and a lot of NATO talking heads and pro-NATO and Micheál Martin's own roadshow, if you Google Neutrality Roadshow, what comes up is Micheál Martin's roadshow, which is the roadshow to destroy Irish neutrality, which he had this consultative forum, what most people now in the anti-war movement call the Con Forum, because he was trying to pull one over on us. But it was all these talking heads from connected to the NATO kind of think tanks and so on, came in to tell us that we had this unreasonable attachment to neutrality, and if only we could get rid of that, we'd be on a road to somewhere because it's outdated, it's outmoded, it's not fit for purpose. But Dame Richardson, she was like basically the chair of the whole thing, and she wrote up the report. And she's like, yes, of course, neutrality has to go. Everybody in the room basically agreed neutrality has to go, and Ireland, the triple lock needs to go. It's just these Irish people have this weird attachment to the concept. But after all this effort, the most recent poll was only a couple of months ago, the dial had moved 3 percentage points. But that's like only more people think neutrality, the triple lock needs to be amended, not like destroyed, but amended. So that's 2 years of constant work, and it is pushing the dial, but it's obviously they would have expected much better results than that.
Yeah, there's just to take up on that part about it being kind of anti-democratic. I think we can maybe talk a little bit more about the media kind of response, but I think so. The Irish state, the state in the south, is one of the most, if not the most, centralised state in Europe. So there's very, very little distribution of power into like local governments or county councils and like the cities. So in response to this move, and which is apparent to many people that it's very anti-democratic, there's been various opportunities for people to find democratic voice in favour of neutrality and protecting the triple lock. And I'd cite two of them, and one was the recent election of Catherine Connolly as president, and neutrality and defending neutrality and promoting neutrality was one of the key plinths of Catherine's campaign, and that was a really, really popular campaign. It was grassroots, as there's people organising up here in Belfast as well, in support of her, and it brought, of course, the broadly understood left in the kind of parliamentary sense together, as well as lots of independents. And part of this was in many senses and almost like a people's referendum on neutrality in a sense. Obviously it doesn't have bearing or on executive power, but there was a strong message sent in that. And the other thing is the county council votes. And it's really interesting that this has happened across North and South, 32 county basis. We had Derry and Strabane County Council and Mid-Ulster putting motions through and voting them through in favour of defending the triple lock in the southern jurisdiction and protecting neutrality. I think they are 2 of 9 altogether. So 9 that have voted in favour of it so far. Now that more recently, as we were talking earlier, there's been a kind of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are getting organised at the local level to stop those. So the last 3 haven't gone through the last month. But those have been, again, grassroots organising, and actually some of the groups that have pushed for those, local organisers, or in some cases councillors, have been people who've attended the roadshow events, particularly the early ones that Niamh and Fionn were doing, including in Derry, that have pushed those, right? So I think there's a democratic drive coming from the people that has various roots of expression that is pushing back against this. And I just want to wind back a little bit to talk about the sovereignty thing and like where we got to this point. And Niamh touched on the economic dimension already, but I think we need to understand the nature of the Irish state in the south as being a kind of dependency. It's an economic dependency on the United States, and the whole FDI, foreign direct investment economy, is based on the South essentially leveraging its membership of the EU in order to act as a bridgehead for American investment. So get American investment in and hold it and trap it. And we can talk maybe later about the tech industry and the specificity of that. But I think the cost of that dependency has been limited sovereignty, right? And it's making decisions about domestic policy, investment in housing, investment in infrastructure, investment in indigenous industries and building those, lack of those things. But it's also about limiting our foreign policy. And, I think this is, and coming back to the question you were starting talking about Palestine, like we've had the Occupied Territories Bill, right? And that went through both houses of the Oireachtas. It had a massive majority in, because Fianna Fáil voted for it. And I don't know if all Fianna Fáil TDs voted for it, if they were whipped to, but they voted for it. So that was voted 2018 into 2019. And then the Fine Gael governments, now including Fianna Fáil, have basically sat on it and blocked it. Now the situation has changed because of the genocide in Gaza, but also changed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war. So now we're seeing that can't be passed, right? And there was a report, and I would definitely urge everyone to read it if they haven't read it, that came out with Uplift. Uplift commissioned it, and it was Paulie Doyle, one of the journalists from The Ditch, and Patrick Bresnan and Patrick Brodie, who are good friends and work with us a lot on other things, basically looking at why is it that the OTB couldn't be passed, and looking at that specifically within the framework of the Irish southern state being a dependency on American capital, and the role that and they go through in immense detail, like and not just trying to making a vague connection between the two, but showing directly how that was stopped, and how the Irish government are essentially, the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments are willing to stop that, to keep the Americans happy. And there's direct threats. It's not just like, oh, they might do something. There's threats from the American ambassador, documented. There's threats from the America's ambassador to Israel. There's threats from senators and Congress people directly talking about Ireland. And so they're very nervous to lose American investment, particularly with the volatility of the kind of tech sector and their particular role to the Trump administration. That's heightened it. But I think we can zoom out from the Occupied Territories Bill and see that this is the structure of Irish foreign policy and its ability to make decisions, sovereign decisions about its own foreign policy, and particularly within the realm of defence and security and militarisation. And so that research is a really good way to look at the broader tendency that we see that's driving this push against neutrality.
And Fionn, just to pick up on one of the points that you made there, so essentially is the thrust of what you were saying there about the potential for the triple lock to be taken away without having a referendum, that it could be just pushed through kind of on a governmental level, and then we just have to live with it come what may?
I mean, there's different possibilities here. So, a simple Dáil majority will get rid of the triple lock. Will bring this bill that we described earlier into being, which will basically dismantle the most important aspect. The UN mandate will go, which means we can go wherever NATO goes, wherever the EU goes, outside basically the realm of international law. What can happen then if we lose this vote? And the thing is, we're a bit hopeful. Like, one of the messages of the Neutrality Roadshow when we go around is that we kind of pressure. We kind of see, especially in terms of the motions that Rory mentioned, we see Fianna Fáil politicians and councillors either vote for the motions to protect the triple lock and kind of reject the government moves to destroy it. They either vote for it, they abstain, they don't show up, or just some of them break ranks or don't obey the whip. And we've seen this in multiple times over the course of the, maybe 13 or so that have been voted on. And within this, you kind of see, there's a wing of Fianna Fáil that have a kind of an attachment to, the De Valera kind of type of republicanism or whatever, that still exists. They're a minority, a very small minority inside Fianna Fáil. But, like in Wexford, for example, the triple lock motion there, it was a tied neck and neck, basically Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael against everybody else, 13-13, and the chair was a Fianna Fáiler, and he voted with the motion and carried the motion. But he came out of that giving quotes to the local radio, saying, I couldn't in good conscience vote for something that puts other people's children in harm's way in the future, in wars that have nothing to do with us. So we're kind of asking people to contact in particular their local Fianna Fáil councillors, senators, MEPs, representatives, to kind of remind them of that this is really a Fianna Fáil, it's their baby. Like, it goes back to Frank Aiken. Bertie Ahern was the one who basically came up with the, in terms of the Nice Treaty, he went around the capitals of Europe to argue for this special carve-out for Ireland to get the Nice Treaty over the line, and that's where the Seville Declaration came from, and that's where it was rebranded. The policy that Niamh said we had since 1960 was rebranded as a triple lock. So it's Bertie's baby. So there is people who kind of remember this, and we're kind of putting pressure on that. But the reality is that, we've had the 2 votes on the Israeli war bonds, where the whip was employed, and the government forces just defeated that twice, and that's shameful shit. Like, that's awful, you know what I mean? But like, maybe there was some Fianna Fáilers or some other people who were like holding their nose in that vote, but they were just obeying the whip. And the whip is like a really powerful thing. That's how new parties are formed in Ireland. It's people sticking to their principles. Like Aontú was formed out of people sticking to their principle on a certain issue. You may not agree with the issue, but they stuck to their principles. So that's like, it's a serious matter. So we don't necessarily expect, given that we had the Israeli war bond example twice recently, we don't necessarily expect that some people would break ranks, but it's a possibility. Okay, let's say we lose that Dáil majority vote. Triple lock is gone. There's another mechanism. Catherine Connolly could bring it for a legal review. We don't think that is the best course of action, because if that fails, that's it. It's just that there's no kind of way to come back at it. The other mechanism is if we get basically the triple lock goes, the Defence Amendment bill becomes the Act 2025. Then, if you get a majority in the Seanad, a simple majority in the Seanad, 30% of the Dáil, and then the assent of the President, you can put it back to the people for a constitutional referendum. Now, these are all quite hypothetical. The majority in the Seanad obviously just replicates the balance of forces in the Dáil, so that's another challenge as well. It's a possibility, though.
And Rory, you mentioned earlier in the talk about the kind of military-industrial complex and how maybe Ireland is being pushed into participating in that more so from the American side. Niamh alluded to it as well in terms of some big American companies being here in Ireland kind of lobbying for further militarization. How much, I think you also talked about it in that last bit that you said there, and how much of what's happening now in terms of Fianna Fáil's campaign to erode Irish neutrality through getting rid of the triple lock is actually related to our seems like really deep need to satisfy American whims, like allow them to use Shannon Airport as a launch pad, and also as a hub for a lot of the big companies, Facebook, Google, Apple, and so on, are here on a lower tax rate. They're incentivized to be here. So how much of what's happening now in terms of Irish neutrality is as a direct impact of the connection with the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Niamh said already, there's various pressure sources, and there's the EU, there's Britain, and then we can kind of umbrella those under kind of a bit of NATO and American drive, and maybe Niamh can speak to some of that afterwards. But so I'll just to directly answer that. So, I mean, in one sense, myself, and I mentioned already Patrick Bresnan and Patrick Brodie, they're also kind of academic colleagues. And we have a paper about to come out, which is should come out next week. And in that, basically, I don't want to be too academic about it, we were trying to ask the question of how are we joining the dots between this kind of Ireland's role as a dependency on American capital, at the same time as EU militarization, which is emerging out of the changing security geopolitical situation in Europe, and then the key role in joining those together that is the US tech sector, monopoly tech sector in Ireland. And essentially, I guess, there's a discussion about where is it that Ireland is actually vulnerable to, and to who, right? And so we have this, and you mentioned this earlier in the talk, all the discussion is about Ireland being this exposed flank to attack from Russia or possibly China, and these are really quite fantastical. But a lot of that focuses on protecting subsea cables, and so these are internet cables that connect the United States or North America with Europe and Britain, and there's very, very exaggerated claims about how many of those actually go into Irish territory, whatever, and you often see this phrase being used that they pass through or near Irish territorial waters, and they were if they're near, they're just not in our territorial waters. That's the open seas, So why is it that why would we have to protect them as opposed to Britain or whatever? But so those are infrastructures that those feed in, of course, to the data center economy, which the Irish state in the south are determined to make Ireland an even greater center of data center development, to take part in this and be a leader in the kind of provisioning of cloud computing for the AI revolution that's meant to be coming now. And of course, that's being pushed not only by the United States, but by the European Union and Britain as well. So basically, Ireland has this infrastructural plan to build out data centers, have more internet cables, and also have green energy to offshore wind to kind of fuel those. And there's plans to directly develop data centers which have their own marine wind that will funnel them, right? So there's an industrial economic plan in place. And what it will do, if it is done, it won't benefit the people greatly, as we see with the current, we hear lots about the tax revenues and how high they are, but that income is very poorly distributed. It's not invested in ways that meet social need. A lot of people get rich out of it. A lot of people don't, right? So they want to make that, to increase that even more. But in doing so, they'll basically make more things that are vulnerable to attack. Now, most of those attacks are quite fantastical, but let's just say for the matter of purpose that, okay, well, more data centers or marine wind or whatever, or LNG, liquid natural gas pipeline coming from the United States, which is going to be passed now. All those things are infrastructures that an enemy of the West or NATO or Europe or whatever, Britain, might want to attack. So why would we want to keep on building them? Because we're basically essentially, we have an economic model which wants to build more targets for fictional threats. And then the idea is, well, we need to protect those. So we need to increase our defences. How do we do that? We buy into the militarisation programme, a project that's being pushed by the EU, and we basically protect those. Now, all the discussion about the subsea cables, those cables are not Irish. They're talked about by the state and commentators as Irish infrastructures. Those are owned by American corporations. Sometimes those pipelines are owned directly by Google or Amazon or whatever. Often they're other companies who provide services to those companies. But we're being expected to shift public money into basically defending corporate infrastructure, and that money goes into the hands of private arms and security companies to provision defense of those. Right. So I think it's a bit of zooming back to try and understand again, like, the structures of dependency and the economic and industrial planning of the government in the South. I don't really think that they are. That's just about answering American capital. It's also trying to kind of do this kind of crab walk where they're trying to answer American capital, the tech industry drive, and also answer the EU's militarisation drive, and these pushes from the British state as well, that, like, Ireland needs to basically pay more to defend Britain, and there's all these pressures coming together, and this is the version of it that the government have come up with. And now, I don't mean by that they're not true believers. Like, I think they are bought into this, particularly the European project. That there is increasingly a discussion that, the United States we're vulnerable to economic fluctuation in the tech sector, and the state is more volatile. So maybe we need to step away from that a little bit. And that discourse is happening in even the kind of quite militaristic, the hawks of American commentary and the government. But actually the plan is to get more dependent, get more involved in the United States via the tech industry. I think that's a really important driver, rather than necessarily just answering what the Trump administration or whatever says. It's about the tech industry.
So the more involved we become in that tech industry, then the more likely it is that we're going to have to, say, in inverted commas, become more militarized to protect those assets.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what we're seeing. And there's no real discussion about that in those terms. Like, we see our infrastructure, the subsea cables, is under threat. We've got a responsibility to Europe, we have a responsibility to Britain, responsibility to the West to defend those. And there's a very slippery discussion, and others can speak more about this, about like what is Ireland? What are we defending? Like, what is it? What's under threat? By who? And what are we defending? And you always see this slippage from defending ourselves into defending Britain, defending Europe, defending NATO, and it's seamless, and there are people who politicians who are big defenders of neutrality, but want to say we should increase military spending to increase our defences, we should have radar, sonar, and increase our intelligence. And you could make a rational argument for this, but I think it's very hard to make that claim when the very structures that we would increase those technologies to defend ourselves are presented. They're coming from this militarization project. They're paid to huge arms companies from Europe and America, and they take place within this context of fictional threats and scaremongering from the political establishment.
It's not only if we become more developed from a technological point of view and then increase our military spending, we're also becoming more dependent on economic relations with the actual companies that are going to be selling us the arms as well. And Niamh, you were speaking earlier about how the sort of threat to Irish neutrality and also how Ireland is perceived on the international stage also relates to the north and not just the south. And it would be really interesting to talk to you about the report that you came upon as you were doing your research.
Well, so so I suppose we're in Belfast for the second time. We had our first roadshow event back in June, And now we're back again. And tomorrow afternoon, we're going to go to Aldergrove for the monthly peace vigil in Aldergrove. So when I was preparing for this afternoon session, I thought, well, I'll just look into doing a bit of research on Aldergrove to see what's happening. And I came across this report, which honestly, it's a report called "Closing the Back Door: Rediscovering Northern Ireland's Role in British National Security," and it's been published by the Policy Exchange think tank, and it's published already. It's almost 2 years old, so it came out in 2024. And it's written by basically British military generals, NATO. I'm not sure if they're at general level, but they're military heads. I'm not sure how high up their ranking was. But basically they've written this report which sets out that Ireland, North and South, signify a massive threat to Britain. Because we're not playing our part, we're freeloading. So there's this term that's kind of, Nancy, Nancy's not happy with that. So there's basically the whole premise behind this Closing the Back Door report is that Ireland is not playing its part. We're freeloading on Britain. That's Ireland. They're talking about 26 counties. We're freeloading on Britain. We haven't done anything. It's kind of Irish intransigence. That we kind of have basically not paid our way in terms of defence and security, what they call defence and security. And so we have to kind of pick up the slack and do our part. So that's the 26 counties. And then they talk about the 6 counties and they say, basically since the Good Friday Agreement, there's been a withdrawal to some extent of British troops from the northern 6 counties, and that also has to now be reversed. And so they have this 2-pronged strategy for how they're going to basically remilitarize Ireland. So they've mentioned Aldergrove. So this is how I came to the report. Was I just looked up Aldergrove, and kind of research who had been writing on it, and I actually thought I'd come to something from like maybe the anti-war movement or a peace activist or something, and instead I come to this policy document where they basically set out, this, like Rory was saying, these kind of hypothetical threats. They set out that like Russia, China and Iran, these are the 3 countries that are named, that they are coming for Britain and they're going to use, and it's all like the northwestern flank. So the northwestern flank, which includes Ireland, is making Britain vulnerable to Russia, China and Iran taking Britain via Ireland. And they name kind of the undersea cables, they name the possibility of a land invasion of Ireland to then actually get to Britain. And so in order to offset this threat that there could be a land invasion of Ireland first, or that there could be sabotaging of the cables and cyber attacks and all the rest of it, the British state needs to intensify its occupation of the 6 counties. I mean, they obviously don't use the word occupation. That they need to intensify their occupation of the 6 counties, and they need to remilitarize, or in effect, somewhat reoccupy the 26 counties, and so that the whole of Ireland would again become part of this British kind of structure, where we would be responding to them. So in the north, they say that they will have to remilitarize. They name specific ports in Derry as an example. They name. They actually say Derry and not Londonderry, which I was surprised by actually in this report. They say militarizing ports in Derry. They mention about remilitarizing. More intensive. So they say that Aldergrove was downgraded, apparently, in the military grading system. It was downgraded with the Good Friday Agreement, and they now plan on ranking it up again. And then they talk about the south, the 26 counties, that they also need to intensify pressure there so that the 26 counties comes on board with this plan. And that was 2 years ago, and we've seen that now being rolled out in many ways. So in the last few weeks and months, we've seen the British NATO general, no, he's not a general, sorry, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, who was on the radio back in October, the same day as the presidential election. So he comes on and he basically rolls out in a radio interview what this policy document sets about. And he's talking on RTE radio because he had just come from an earlier session at the House of Lords, where the House of Lords is discussing this policy document. So this policy document, it's not just a document that's kind of written and sits there and does nothing, gathering dust, and it's kind of this benign, like kind of set of opinions from these British military people. It's forming the basis of the strategy that the British government is rolling out to further militarise and further occupy and further control Ireland. And so we have the House of Commons now, or the House of Lords, laying out the strategy for how that will go. And then we have these kind of talking heads from different, from the military, being platformed on the Irish media, telling us, we had Chris Parry tell us, this is a direct quote, that we're good fighters. It's something in the temperament. He's on, and then Claire Byrne starts to joke about that we're good fighters. So it's all a big laugh that we're good fighters. Oh, kind of, do you mean in the pub or do you mean on the battlefield kind of thing? So we're told we're good fighters. It's something in the temperament. We were told that Ireland is a necessary partner in the free world, like defending the free world. This language is being used. We were told that neutrality and nuclear-free zones upset Britain's war strategy. So this is what's playing out. This is the reality. And as we see, like what's set out in the document 2 years ago is what's happening now. So unless we shift focus or, unless we really throw a spanner in the works, I can imagine that Aldergrove will be upgraded. It talks about joining this joint expeditionary force. I can imagine that Ireland will join this joint expeditionary force. When Chris Parry is on the radio saying we'll have a military radar, they want to put a radar in the west of Ireland. I can imagine that they will put a military radar in the west of Ireland. So, yeah, that report it blew my mind reading it, but I think it also blew my mind reading it almost 2 years since it was published and seeing how a lot of it has come to pass and will continue to come to pass, and just how far along we are in that strategy. And how, like, when you think, like, I remember when the wave of reports came out, within a week 4 opinion pieces were published about that Ireland and Britain need to have this security alliance or security pact or whatever. And it was like, there's something else going on. It's not that these 4 people came up with this idea independent of each other. It's like there's a strategy playing out. There's a strategy playing out, and it feels almost like, and it's, sometimes I wonder, am I being too conspiratorial? But then I find a document like that and I think, well, no, actually, no. People have sat down around a table and planned this out. They've written a policy document on it. They've sent it to the House of Lords. They've agreed on it. And now it's being rolled out. And we're on the receiving end of that. And
Harris met Starmer recently, and they've agreed to basically reassess and come up with a new defence arrangement between Ireland and England, and that's supposed to be finalised, I think, by July next year. So this is all coming together, and this is the point. Like, these are the people that we're getting in bed with. When we step back from the UN mandate system, I mean, it's Britain who still occupy a part of our country, who talk about us, as Niamh was saying, as if colonialism never ended, almost, and then there's NATO, who've just armed and backed to genocide to the hilt and basically orchestrated it, and then you have the EU, who are not like some benign force. And when the EU goes out into the world, they do imperialism, and we've been complicit in that to a certain extent as well. I mean, Ireland has, like, we used to talk about, I've kind of taken it out of the roadshow, but we used to talk about Mali. I used to talk about Mali a lot, because Ireland had defence forces there for 10 years. We were involved in 2 missions. It's a long story, but effectively, there's really good chance, there's quite a lot of evidence points to our complicity in quite a lot of corruption in terms of the training mission there, and irregularities around that. And then the people that we trained like went out and commit war crimes, and these are well documented by Human Rights Watch and Human Rights Watch and a few other groups. And then there was also a kind of a separate mission where we were working alongside the Germans doing reconnaissance. And it's highly likely, but we'll never know because questions about this that were put into the Bundestag have been redacted and made classified by the German military. But it's quite likely that, you know, the one war crime that was investigated was this wedding party was bombed in a town called Bounty in January 2021. But, and, you know, 26 people were killed and more were injured. But it's highly likely that the Irish forces that were over there were part of the reconnaissance team that ran the drone that got the intelligence that provided the French the intelligence they needed to bomb the wedding. So, but like the report into the investigation into that showed that these kind of events were quite common. So basically, you had events where, like in multiples of tens, these terrorists were taken out. But the reason in this investigation into this wedding atrocity, it basically showed that the burden of proof, the kind of criterion for deciding whether or not this was like a terrorist gathering, which the French maintained for a very long time. This was a bunch of terrorists, and that means they automatically all need to be killed, apparently. But that if there was no women and children found among the dead when they went in afterwards, they would automatically just classify them all as terrorists. So it's highly likely that the Irish Defence Forces were involved in gathering intelligence for multiple instances of this kind of, you know, really badly ran attack and atrocities and basically war crimes. So that's like us. That's under the UN mandate system. There was a UN mandate for the going into Mali. Everything was above board. So that's like within the terms of the Triple Lock, we sent people out there to do this work, and like that's the EU just abroad, you know, doing colonialism, neo-colonialism, imperialism. And so we're up to our neck in it when we go off to the EU. And the whole point is that when the Triple Lock goes, we step back from the UN mandate system. Our first port of call, before NATO even, but it may as well be the same thing because nearly everybody in Europe is in NATO, but it will be the EU and then NATO.
Niamh, it's not surprising that Westminster still views Ireland, both north and south, as kind of an asset to be exploited and manipulated. Even I lived in Cork for a long time, and you would every so often see a British Navy ship in the port of Cork for a few days or even more than that. But at the same time, it is quite shocking to see it in such stark, like in black and white in that report, and I assume that people can find that report online. And how do you think that all of the things that Niamh brought up as part of that report and some of the stuff that you guys have mentioned in terms of the deepening our connection with the American tech industry, remilitarisation, and having more and more connections with kind of military superpowers and super companies that are supplying weapons of mass destruction that are being used to commit genocide in places like Palestine. How does all that fit into the discourse around potential reunification of Ireland?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that you know, the debate as it has been in, and I don't mean necessarily a kind of grassroots level debate, but the kind of policy debate that largely happens in Ireland. The British aren't very concerned about it. There's been loads of reports, loads of books, and there's this is it ARM, the project, the long-term project with the Irish Times and Queen's University and so on. They're basically they look at a reunification, the possibilities of it, and it's largely looked at, and this is discussed in the Irish media kind of at quite great length. RTE, Irish Times, who are commissioning some of this research. It's talked about principally in terms of constitutional issues, like what type of state would it be, why would it happen, in terms of identity, like how do we have a kind of new pluralism, which in a United Ireland has space for a kind of plurality of people who maybe feel they're British or the Union. How do we integrate unionists into another state, or in fact what does it mean to like not integrate unionists into United Ireland, but what does it change, and all these things. And there's a bit of discussion about the economy and how important that is. Geopolitics, questions of security, defence, military is basically almost totally ignored. I think that's starting to change. And some of the stuff that Niamh was mentioning, these reports coming out, or we're starting to see a kind of increasing amount of attention to, hold on a second, what are the stakes of this for unification? And I think there has been quite a long history since the 40s when NATO was being established, a kind of history of there being a transactional discussion about would Ireland be unified if it joined NATO? And NATO approached the government, then the Republic in the south in 1949, and said, do you want to join NATO? Ireland said, yes, we do, on condition that we have unification and the British withdraw from Northern Ireland. And the British obviously said no to that. And being like a founding and major member of NATO, albeit secondary to the United States, that was the end of that. And there was kind of forays again and discussions about this over the past. And I think now that we have this kind of structure in play for unification to happen, and there's a lot of discussion here obviously about the democratic mechanisms for that, and the fact that, well, it still needs to be the British minister that'll call it and all that. There's very little discussion about the context in which that happens. So what are the forces at play in it? And I think that's where we're starting to see this kind of relation, that transactional version come back, right? And I think there's actors, political actors in the south, and I think Fine Gael, I was talking earlier about Leo Varadkar, is kind of taken on the mantle as like the figure of a certain type of nationalist vision of reunification of Ireland from Fine Gael. And like I like to joke about like the blue shirts wearing the green jersey, and he's been up here a lot advocating for that and trying to position Fine Gael as this. We also see branches of unionism here in the north, and I'm particularly really interested in this kind of unionist Atlanticism, I'd call it, like where you have people like Paul and John Bew. Paul Bew is a former professor of politics in Queen's University, very important figure here. He's now in the House of Lords. It was him that in fact called the meeting in the House of Lords where they debated that report that Niamh was talking about, and it's where Chris Parry, the Rear Admiral, former NATO commander, gave evidence. Also on that committee is Kate Hoey, who's also not a unionist party, but a unionist inclined politician, now in the House of Lords, used to be a Labour MP. She left over Brexit, became friends with Nigel Farage. So there's these kind of people that are like unionist politicians working at the heart of the British kind of political establishment in the House of Lords, driving this kind of military thing. And I think many of them, they're not too fussed about, like, you know, they're enlightened liberal unionists. They're not too fussed about whether he's United Ireland. Like, I'm sure Paul Bew doesn't really care about this. Quite happy, but they are very, very committed Atlanticists. So it's kind of a version of, we can actually have a United Ireland. We can take that. Maybe it's a bit of a federal thing. Unionists can still be unionists, have their identity, but we'll have it as part of this Atlantic security nexus, right? And I think that's seriously a driving thing that is not being talked about much. And just to talk again, I mean, I get kind of like slightly like my nemesis, these men that I don't know in the world. But John Bew, who's the son of Paul Bew, who is an academic, he teaches war studies in King's College in London, from Belfast, grew up in Belfast. Paul Bew, not from Belfast, but made his career here. He's actually from Cork, I think. He is the key security advisor to the last 4 Tory MPs, so I can't even list them off. I mean, they all went quick, right? It started with Johnson, and he wrote Global Britain, which was Boris Johnson's 2021 defence strategy. He is now, as far as I know, still Keir Starmer's principal security advisor, also one of the architects behind the UK government's defence strategy, which is rearmament plan, which came out in June. So again, another Belfast-born kind of unionist-inclined, liberal unionist who is like driving this kind of Atlanticist vision, right? So I think, you know, the conversation about unification, North and South and in Britain, needs to kind of, and certainly from those on the left, or those who may be anti-imperialist or Republican inclined, or whatever mix of those, need to take seriously that there are people who will perhaps welcome and drive unification, as long as unification is part of a kind of a NATOification, I'd call it. And I think that will likely be a kind of carrot that is dangled. And we need to take that very, very seriously. And I think there's organised forces, political forces in Britain, the North, and the South that are working towards that end.
just maybe to give an example of a quote from the report. So the Closing the Back Door report, it opens with a quote which is, "There is no doubt that for reasons of geography of the island of Ireland has considerable strategic importance to the UK and NATO." So they're basically taking the whole island as strategic importance for the protection of Britain. And it's an inconvenience that there happens to be another state jurisdiction in the south. It's an inconvenience, but it's not an obstacle that isn't, it can't be overcome. Like imagine writing a report like this about, I don't know, Denmark or Iceland or France or something, and then it the quote ends with a reference to the harbours and facilities at Queenstown in the southwest of Ireland. Now, Queenstown is the name that the British used for Cove. I don't know if you know Cove in County Cork. So Cove, Cove is one of the main ports in Ireland. Like for years and years, that's where the Titanic stopped after, before it crossed. So Cove is obviously a significant place. But the fact that it's incredible. They say Derry, but they say the harbour and facilities at Queenstown in southwest of Ireland. So, this total erosion of a process where this 26 counties may have tried to kind of, form an independent to whatever extent state with place names or whatever, like this kind of symbolic withdrawal of, the painting of the post boxes green instead of red, naming stuff in Irish and as well as English, or all of these things. But the report starts with a quote that says Queenstown and not Cove. Like that kind of sets the tone for the way the whole thing kind of takes shape from there.
Just one thing on that, and I think also Niamh was reading it. I have not read this report yet. I have it printed out in my desk. Looking forward to it. But they also kind of quote a version of like the 1993 Downing Street Declaration, where the British state has no selfish strategic and economic interest in Northern Ireland, right? So, and the other important part, or crucial part of the Downing Street Declaration, is that the British government committed to recognising that the people of this place, their democratic rights should steer the process. So it seemed to be like the British government coming round at long last to the what became the peace process, and it was John Hume that put that line. It was him that wrote the thing that no selfish strategic economic interests in there, blah blah blah. I think we can very clearly say that is dead. If that was ever the case, now it's like with this new kind of threat environment and new geopolitical conditions, this place very clearly has selfish geostrategic, and it's selfish because they're basically saying Ireland, all of it, including a separate jurisdiction, need to play by British security interests, or else there's going to be a problem. And they haven't rejected the fact that the democratic will of people here should direct the process, but of course that's curtailed in very strict ways by the Good Friday Agreement. So you're like, I think there's significant impacts on the meaning of the Good Friday Agreement and the democratic pathways towards unification because of the geostrategic changes that are underway and the way the British state is manoeuvring itself and insisting that the Irish state manoeuvre itself. So I think we're actually we had a lot of discussion about Brexit, had really put a lot of effects on the Good Friday Agreement and the constitutional status and so on of the North. I think this is another thing that is doing that, but there's not a discussion about it, and that's very troubling to me.
I had alarm bells going off when I was listening to Niamh earlier on talking about the effective rolling back of this demilitarisation that happened in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, and at the same time, like we're on the Falls Road here in the heart of West Belfast, a community that went through decades of struggle along with the rest of the 6 counties, and a lot of that struggle was done in the name of a united Ireland. Now, if you go back to the 70s and the 80s and even in the 90s, the kind of call to arms was a 32 county socialist republic. And what's kind of freaking me out now is that we're talking about reunification on a whole other on different terms. There, which like 32 county socialist republic brings a lot of things to mind that aren't included in a reunification that involves being beholden to the geopolitical aspirations of the United States of America and of the European Union. And it just seems like it's not being discussed at all. You know, a lot of the discussion about reunification is how are we going to integrate the people who identify as being British on this island into a United Ireland, which in this context seems to be one of is not as big of a thing, you know, because as you mentioned, like there are probably a lot of people who come from a Protestant background or a Unionist background that maybe, if not now, would see the benefit of being one united country in terms of economic benefit, in terms of trade, and in terms of travel and everything like that. But then on the other hand, there are a lot of people who would have kind of been ideologically really determined for the reunification of Ireland, that these would be bigger issues, I would say, and even for people from a Protestant background in the north here, who would also be concerned about the NATOification of United Ireland. So how do we bring this to the top of the agenda when it comes to the conversation around the reunification? Because we're arguably closer to reunification now than we ever have been since the time of partition.
You go.
You can take it away.
I was going to mention. It's really interesting if you read there's a lot of telegrams that were sent over and back between Ireland and between De Valera and Churchill during World War II. And there was a serious amount of pressure being put on Ireland to give up its neutrality in the 26 counties and to join World War II on the side of the Allies. And there's one telegram that was sent, and it's Churchill basically dangling a carrot saying, "A nation once again," that's the direct quote, "a nation once again, basically as long as you join up with the Allies and come on board." And De Valera says, "No, we'll keep our neutrality," or whatever. And, well, history played out. But it almost feels like that's going to come about again, and that that will be the trade-off. So the trade-off is, how much do you want a united Ireland? And do you want it enough that you're willing to accept it within this NATOized structure? So they mightn't call it, they mightn't say Ireland is going to come, the whole of Ireland is going to come back under British rule. There'd be probably uproar. But if they sell us this package where you have this reunification of the island brought under, what title they give it, who knows? But it wouldn't be, I think, the United Ireland that any of us want, where it's basically being controlled, like they say in the document, they want to uphold a US-led world order. That's a direct quote. And to uphold the US-led world order, they need to secure the whole of Ireland. And so it's like that's the carrot that's going to be dangled, and who's going to go for that? So, like we're sitting in West Belfast, are the people here going to go for that? In County Clare, where I'm from, are they going to go for that? In Wexford, I don't know. It's how do you package it, and how do you get people to come on board with it? Or do you make it so uninteresting that you actually do it without people even realising? Because like we were saying, Brexit probably was an easier thing to talk about, and there was an awful lot of media attention on it. But all of this is kind of being framed in such a way that it's, well, the Russians are coming for us, so what else can we do except respond in this way? And this is kind of the price that we have to pay to keep ourselves, keep ourselves safe, bring ourselves under this structure. And, well, yeah, that's kind of how it's being sold. How do we bring people along into a conversation to kind of push back against this? Well, that's kind of what we've been doing on the roadshow. So it's kind of neutrality. You can't really talk about neutrality without talking about sovereignty, and you can't talk about those two things without talking about anti-imperialism. And then you talk about, what do we mean by anti-imperialism in Ireland today, and going forward? So I don't know if that made sense or not. But anyway.
We've spoke about Fianna Fáil and the campaign that they've run to erode this, the concept of Irish neutrality and get rid of the triple lock. And we've even spoke about the kind of Leo Varadkar coming up to the north, sort of carrying this message of unification, but under very different terms than what we would have sort of been used to, or what we have in mind for the reunification from an ideological point of view. What do we know about the attitudes and the policies and the sort of manifesto of people in the opposition benches in the Dáil when it comes to Irish neutrality as it stands at the minute?
I mean, basically, almost everybody is on board to defend neutrality. Sinn Féin have actually been quite good. Mary Lou has headed up her own Neutrality Roadshow. I know, like, as far as I know, she's done at least like maybe 8. Yeah, around that. Like she was in Wexford, she was in Cork, she was in, and they we're getting like reasonable turnouts, and she's like, putting that forward, that message forward that they need to defend Irish neutrality. Ain too have been very good. They're very strong on Irish neutrality. PBP have been good. Soc Dems have been good. Some of the best communication has actually come from the Soc Dems. Labour are saying that they're in favour of maintaining Irish neutrality, and they're just not really showing up for the events and so on, and kind of like going out there and just doing that bit extra. And then of course I mean, that's pretty much all the opposition, right?
Look, the roadshow is such a valuable asset for people who want to learn more about this. And actually, the first time really that I kind of started to come to terms with the triple lock and Irish neutrality was listening to Claire Daly when she came to Belfast last year as part of Féile an Phobal, who put things in very straightforward terms. Because when you're listening to politicians on the news, for the most part, it is quite difficult to decipher what it is they're actually trying to say, and I suppose a lot of that is actually done on purpose, so that people are like, yeah, it sounds alright, then just go along with it, like, we've voted for Fianna Fáil our whole lives, like, carry on, I'm sure they're doing a good job. So it's been great to have you here, and thanks very much for going around and sharing the information that we so badly need to get, given everything that we've spoken about today. For people who want to find out more, or even what would you like people to do actually as a follow-on from this, and maybe that would be a good way for us to finish up.
So when we started the roadshow in May, we're talking about the UN mandate and all the rest of it. An awful, things are happening at such a quick pace, it's really hard to keep up. But I suppose since we started the roadshow, we've had the mission that was approved in Haiti, which has nothing to do with peace. And we've had now the basically UN rubber stamping what will be an expansion of like Zionism, colonialism in Gaza, with the UN rubber stamping it, which is the resolution that was passed for the so-called stabilization force that will be deployed to Gaza. So I suppose I'm just mentioning these things because of the pace that things are going at. We mightn't have come out so strongly on UN mandates back in May. Who knows? But just to say, there's the pace of this is really fast. So what we're saying today, by the time the podcast is released, might already be out of date. But just going to the question about what we expect people to do. So what we've been saying to people is that basically the roadshow was the idea was that we would go out and inform people to counter the disinformation or misinformation that they're getting in the media, because there's been so much of it, and from politicians. So I suppose the first step is to be informed, and then to take action. And taking action will mean different things to different people. So we've had people come to the roadshow that have participated in direct action in Shannon. They've gone out in their own way. Peaceful action to search planes. They've now been criminalised and they're before the courts. So some people will go and do that as their form of action. There's people who are protesting at, for example, in Simon Harris's office in Bray. Is it Bray or Greystones? I never remember. Greystones. But basically going to politicians' offices and protesting on the triple lock. There's letter writing campaigns, there's sending emails. So there's an awful lot of things you can do, but I think the first thing you can do is get informed, which is kind of what we set out to do.